My name's Emily Wilson. I'm a journalist at The Guardian, and I'm responsible there, amongst other things, for our environmental coverage and also our global development coverage. The subject today is carbon leapfrogging. Should emerging economies such as India be expected to go directly from where they are now to a perfect clean tech future, jumping over fossil fuel development? Should they, can they, and is it fair to ask them to do so when the current developed world has been built on fossil fuel? The sort of ethical bit of it, I know President Nasheed hates it, but it is a live argument in bits of the world. I've just been living in Australia, and there the Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg last year talked about the strong moral case for coal, because Australian coal was giving electricity to poor Indian children and lifting them up and saving countless lives. First we're going to ask our two speakers to introduce themselves, the work they're doing right now, and just to give a kind of opening sally on their reaction to the subject of today. We've lost one speaker, but the other speaker, Dr. Dan Kammen, unfortunately can't be here for family reasons. So first, President Nasheed is the former president of the Maldives and is a man who's been imprisoned and tortured for his political beliefs. Would you tell us a bit about your work now and what you think about carbon leapfrogging?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning. I am in exile now. We were toppled in a coup in 2012. And then I was later arrested, spent another year in jail. I was fortunate to leave the Maldives, leave jail for medication. And then I sought asylum in the United Kingdom. So that's where I stand. When we were in government, we had a view that we could make the country carbon neutral. For the Maldives, electricity generation through diesel is very expensive. Sometimes it goes to about 70 cents a unit. And you would know today, renewables are far cheaper. It can be as cheap as, I understand, recently in India, one of the bids were cheaper than coal. If you take another country in South Asia, Sri Lanka, it produces 1,300 megawatts of diesel-generated electricity at a cost of 30 cents a unit. You can do the same in Sri Lanka for 20 cents a unit. The Sri Lankan international reserves, or the Sri Lankan economy, would save $1.1 billion if they switch. And for me, I have come to believe and understand that there is a low carbon development strategy. That development need not always be equal to carbon emission. You can have the same economic outcomes, or rather better economic outcomes, through a different economic path or different way of governing a country. In the early part of the last century, governments were run on Keynesian economics. Most of them were run on Keynesian economics, with stimulus packages, stop-go policies, and so on. But when we came to the end of the century, the late 70s and 80s, governments started running their economies on monetarism through interest rates and so on. I have a view that these received economic wisdoms are also obsolete as much as the coal, fossil fuel technology. And there is another economics, another view, another ideology, a theory that you could use to run countries. What I am trying to do now is to make climate change an election issue in countries. In my view, to do that, we must formulate a low carbon manifesto or a political manifesto that political parties can embrace. And hopefully politicians then can make the same kind of pledges, full employment, housing, sewerage systems, embankments, and so on. But these political pledges to be based on the new manifesto, which would be an environment-friendly manifesto. We must find a name for this manifesto first. You would remember at the beginning of the last century, communism came to be a ruling method, or rather countries took that to be a way of governance. And it went on until this last century, and then it collapsed. So we are now in need for a new thinking, a new manifesto, a new political manifesto. So my work now centers around, part of my work centers around trying to formulate that new manifesto and trying to see if political parties who lose elections and who are now thinking on how to win the next election, to give them ideas on how to win an election. So I believe that you can win an election through these new ideas, making new pledges, same pledges, but through a different path. I think I'll stop there. I mentioned that this is part of the work that I am doing. I'm still the leader of the opposition in the Maldives, so I keep doing that work, and I'm hopeful to be back in the Maldives soon.
Over to Dr. Samir Saran, who's Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation.
Thank you, Emily. So he's been to prison, he's in exile, and he has also tortured himself by hosting cabinet meetings underwater. I have not had these experiences, and the closest I've been to hardship was my time at the London School of Economics and then in Cambridgeshire. I never had the privilege of being in this town, Oxford. I want to respond to a couple of points made by you, Emily, in your opening introduction, as well as by the President, and let me try and also respond to the theme, energy leapfrogging or carbon imperialism. So in 2015, as we were moving towards what later became the Paris Agreement, there was hectic negotiations on the sidelines leading up to that conference between France and India, US and India, US and China, France and China. India has always been the leader of the global trade union. We are the opposition leader of the world. So when you want a global agreement, we say no. So it was important to get India on board. And under Prime Minister Modi, there seemed to be an opportunity if we could appeal to his imagination to take India towards a new direction. There was hope that India would this time agree to an agreement. So after one of the meetings with the representative of the United States and one of the advisors to the Prime Minister on climate change, the advisor asks me, what was the US representative offering us? He asked me this question, what was the offer on the table? I said the offer was quite simple. The offer was, one, China was the last country that would use fossil fuels to lift its poor to a middle income existence. India will be the first country in the world who will have to do that same task without using fossil fuels. That was the first proposition, that India will be the first country in the world that will move millions out of poverty to low income and mid income existence without using fossil fuels, without bulk manufacturing, without huge exports of over long distances, because that's unsustainable. The second offer was that because India has to lift 300 million people out of poverty, we are sorry we don't have the money and the means to help you. So you have to do it largely on your own. Find your own solutions and find your own answers. And third, even though you will be the first country in the world of significant size to do this ever, and you will have to do it using your own means and resources. We want in an agreement the right to judge you. We want to have the right to monitor your progress. And this was the proposition to India placed before the Paris Agreement. And then he asked me, so what should we do? I said, accept it. Because it is also the fourth and the unoffered part of the proposition was that you will be the first country in the world to create a new model of growth, that which by itself will be exportable to the whole world. So if the Japanese gave us a certain kind of manufacturing, if the Chinese gave us mass manufacturing, if the industrial models of Europe and America were exported all over the world, this new Indian model of transformation is by itself a deliverable. So yes, energy leapfrogging is clearly a part of it. Let me share some numbers with you. I did a study which was published in that same year, 2015, by the Brookings Institute in the US, and I found that every Indian, as a relative share of his expenditure, spends nearly 2.5 times more than an average American on procuring renewable energy. So every Indian spends 2.5 times more than an American on procuring renewable energy. They spend 4 times more than every Japanese. They spend 1.5 times more than every Chinese, and they spend just under 2/3 of that of a German. The Germans are still gold standard when it comes to renewables. But let me complete that thought. By 2022, India is determined to have 175 gigawatts of renewable energy in play, which is more than the entire generation capacity of Germany. So we are going to, in the next 7 years, install 135 gigawatts of Germany of renewable energy, which is roughly what Germany has installed over 200 years. That is the task in front of us. I'm just scoping the challenge of what energy leapfrogging really means. We must start understanding this. But that does not mean, and here I disagree with the title, I don't agree with the word or. I think energy leapfrogging is happening, is required, is ethical, but carbon imperialism exists. And let me share another set of numbers for you. First of all, the proposition made by the US itself was imperial. I think itself was unethical. It smacked of 3 distinct traits of imperialism. 1, we know and you don't, so hence do as we know. 2, that we have the moral fabric to tell you this, we have the moral fiber, or we have the ethical high ground to tell you this, because our actions somehow are through enlightened politics and yours are not. And third, we have the courage, and we still have the capacity to patronize you by talking down on you. And let me complete this thought again. During those negotiations, when we asked the bloc of the EU and the Americans that why don't they tell the banks to divert more money for finance, why don't they tell the technology companies to bring down IPR, they say they don't listen to us. It's market forces. And the Brazilian negotiator tells them, but you believe that we will listen to you, because you still believe that you have the imperial power over us, that you can't tell your companies what to do, you can't tell your banks what to do, but you can come to the emerging and developing world and tell them what to do. So you still believe that there exists this political equation where you can tell us what to do. So carbon imperialism also exists, and let me share a few numbers on that. Again, a study that was published by the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2016 beginning, my study on coal, I discovered that an average American burns 5 times more coal than an Indian does. An average German burns 3 times more coal than an average Indian does. And of course, the Chinese are global champions on this, 6 times more than an average Indian does. So what I'm trying to say is that Emily, you raised the point that coal is, it is moral to export coal from Australia to India.
No,
or Josh Frydenberg said it, and
yes.
you were quoting him. Let me qualify that. I think it will be moral till such time that even 1 gigawatt of coal capacity exists in Europe. I think for every plant that South Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, Nigeria want to set up of coal, one must shut down in Europe and the US. And I think the morality argument will remain valid till we see dramatic action here. In fact, last year, Germany has has announced between 14 to 16 plants depending on various news reports. The OECD has added 58 gigawatts of coal capacity in the last 7 or 8 years. And due to voodoo science, by banning nuclear, Germany today has 10 times dirtier electricity than France. The Germany's voodoo science that has decided to ban nuclear is as voodoo as Trump's voodoo science that believes climate change is not happening. I think we are at two extremes here, and I believe that some of the liberal ideologies are as rigid and are as and will defeat solutions as severely as some of the policies of the right. And I will leave my opening remarks here.
Since you did raise President Trump, what impact do you think he's going to make on the world's groping, however inadequate, towards a carbon-free future?
Groping.
Well, I mean, stumbling. Bad word.
Bad word.
Bad word.
Connect with
yes,
the president.
Bad word.
My view is whatever presidents say, what's happening in the world is what the people are doing. And the American people and a large amount of people in a number of countries have decided that we have to change, that things can't go business as usual. And therefore, I don't think there is any politician or political leader who can actually turn this around. You can love coal as much as you want. You can be as imperial as you want to be, but this will be ongoing. There is nothing anyone can do about it. It's already an economic argument. It's the profit motive and the market mechanism will save the planet. Unfortunately, it will not include the Maldives because it's a little bit late for us. But by and large, my view is that it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. We have set in motion a process that would deliver another economics, that would deliver another industrial path. And I am sure India is going to embrace that, because India would be the future leaders. And if you are unable to embrace the new technology, if you are unable to embrace the future, you cannot be the future leaders. If the United States, the people of the United States, wants to relinquish their world leadership, well, they can do that. But that's not going to stop the rest of the world, and that's not even going to stop the United States from transforming. So for me, political rhetoric is really not part of this equation at all. It's going, the train's left, and it will go to its destination.
Sorry, I thought you'd stopped.
Yeah, I have.
Are you, that's really optimistic and good to hear. Are you as optimistic?
No, I agree with the president. I think he's right that countries like India have decided that they are going to adopt a different pathway. And that was my opening point. But I probably, in a sense, nuance his position and mine by saying that imperialism still exists, which means that you are going to see countries try to derive maximum benefit and power and influence by control of technologies, by control of returns on investment, by making sure that the benefits of this new economic pathway still remain concentrated in only a few economies. And I think those are questions we need to think about. But on the issue of popular leaders or populist leaders like Trump and their impact on the debate, I think you have two examples in recent times. You had two leaders who were appealing to constituencies which were very different to the ones that elected previous statesmen. One in India, for example, and one in the US. And Prime Minister Modi used his popularity amongst his cadres and the masses to actually shape the narrative towards the solution at Paris. So he was able to bring the cultural context that Indians traditionally have lived as one with nature. The global community is one village. Our actions impact everyone. We have to do this for all other citizens on this planet, and he was able to move India from being the head of the global trade union to being a part of the global management of this big crisis. So here is one instance of a popular leader using his popularity for creating a solution, and the Trump is using popular rhetoric to cater to a different basic primal vulnerability, fear, or need of a different constituency. But he's right. I think institutions are strong enough not to be swayed by 4 years of 8 years of leadership. I think the primary question for me is not Trump. The primary question is only one actor who has actually not signed on to the Paris Agreement. There is one major actor in the world who has still not signed on to the Paris deal or the climate deal, and unless we bring them on the table, energy leapfrogging will be more difficult and carbon imperialism will exist. And that one actor is the global banking community. I did not see the bankers sign on to the climate agreement. The global banking norms still don't allow more than X% of total lending to flow towards renewable energy or to flow towards green infrastructure. They also don't allow flow of money to certain geographies because they are considered risky, and they price the money so high that it becomes unaffordable for certain other geographies. The bankers have not signed on to the climate deal. And I think unless you bring the bankers in, you are not going to be able to fully realize the potential that this moment offers us. So the Trump presidency could be detrimental to, it may delay the socializing of certain actors by a few years, but I don't think he can deny it.
So how can the global banking community be brought on board? Who can make them? How can it happen?
We have this strange situation where I keep on agreeing with Sarun. But ORF writes a running commentary on the political situation in the Maldives. We are talking about Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank, and basically these two very important institutions. Now, if I completely agree with Sarun here, if the financial world is unable to understand the financial returns from the new economy, again, my argument would be that they're doing this because they're ignorant. They're doing it because they're stuck in another century. They're doing it because they are obstructed by vested interest, especially fossil fuel industry and everything related to that. So unless the World Bank board and the IMF board decides to allow finance to follow to developing countries, this is of course going to be difficult. So our question would be, how can we overcome this? Perhaps again, I think the market must do it. People must realize, investors must realize that they have a better return by investing in this new economy. I think it's quite clear that your $1 invested in renewables produce a better return and a faster GDP growth than $1 invested in fossil fuel. So we need to do this maths. Someone needs to, an economist needs to sit down and do this maths and say, well, this is the return that you have. I think we need to change the climate change argument, or rather bring the climate change argument to a more economics argument than an ethical argument. I mean, I do understand the ethics of it, and I do believe that it's a human rights issue as well. But we will not get going with it until we anchor this properly as an economic issue. So we must have auditors, financiers, and economists talking about this issue and doing the sums, so it makes it very clear to the banks that they would get a better return by investing in India now than, for instance, investing in some other place. So how do you calculate returns, and how would you do these maths? So we've come to this point, always arguing that there is a moral argument here. Of course there is a moral argument here, but there is a financial argument. And I would like people to point out the financial argument to the bank. Your question was, how would we get the banks to release their funds? My view is that by telling them you'll get a better return.
But the World Bank has got a relatively new leader, and he talks a great green game. He says that all their development projects, they're keeping the environment in mind at all times. So they talk as if they're truly green.
No, they are. I mean, to be fair to the Bretton Woods, I think they have swung to the other end of the spectrum in the last 3 or 4 years, to the detriment of basic infrastructure requirements in many countries. So they now use the green equation for everything, including providing, social rural roads and infrastructure. And how is that going to contribute to this green agenda? I think, let me answer your question in a different way. Let me unclutter the conversation on ensuring financial flows. So there are 3 main agents, and there are many, but 3 main agents. One, of course, is the international infrastructure finance and development finance institutions, Bretton Woods, and the new banks that have come up, the Chinese bank, the BRICS bank, and some other regional development banks. So you have this one set of actors who I think more or less have, to varying degrees, agreed that green is the path ahead. So whether it's the AIIB, which is lending money on renewable projects, or the BRICS Bank, which is committed to a number of green projects in the first 7, and the World Bank, you see this secular trend towards a green agenda. The second actor is the commercial bank, which lend you money from London or New York, syndicate from Paris and other places, and they work under what we call the Basel norms for banking, and it is the Basel norms that restrict or allow movement of capital to certain sectors. So they say that a percentage of your lending is to be given to infrastructure sector. Now, unless that percentage is increased or changed, you will not be able to direct more money to renewables, because renewables will be competing with all other infrastructure as well. And countries in the global south need to build roads, need to build ports, need to build coastlines, need to safeguard themselves from high tides and rising sea levels. And renewable energy is actually competing with all of these baskets of challenges that the developing world is facing. So is it time to think of a green Basel? So can we think of a new regulatory framework where a certain amount of lending should go towards green infrastructure projects? So can we create a new classification and a new segment of flows that flow towards these kind of projects? And the third actor, and which I think is again a part of why I say that where I'm sitting and your neighbors are imperialists, because you still sit on the world's largest chunk of money, lazy money, what I call lazy money, which gives you no returns, which are your pension funds and insurance funds, and which are criminal in ensuring that none of the money goes towards these sectors, which are most important, and to these geographies, the emerging world, where it is most required. There's an IMF report, and this is not an Indian report, this is an IMF report which says there's over 100 or 150 trillion dollars of global savings in these kind of big funds, and there is still a $3 to $4 trillion infrastructure gap in the emerging world. Just by the interest rates of this money, you will be able to meet the infrastructure gap in emerging worlds and earn a much higher rate of return. In the next 5 to 7 years, the EU, UK, and not the US, but they've been smarter, the EU and the UK will certainly be unable to commit to their pension commitments, their pension to people's retirement commitments, because they have parked their money, which is now earning zero. Because the political will, the regulatory will to allow this money to be deployed as productive capital in some of the emerging parts of the world is lacking. And this stems from the same mindset that I was talking about, that is a barbaric world, that is an uncivilized world. We don't understand their politics, we don't understand their people, we don't understand their language, and how can I park my money in that terrible, terrible part of the world? Yeah. And that is imperialism for me.
Is it a lack of will, or is it ignorance?
It's imperialism, and it's a mix of everything, from ignorance to fear to lack of political will, but it stems from fear. It stems from not understanding that someone darker than you can be more smart, can use your money more wisely. It stems from that basic fear that my life savings are going to be in a Nigerian hand. And I think this is racist, this is imperialist, and unless we get over this fear of the other being able to now manage money in ways that are going to be productive for you, you are not going to be able to move this huge pot of lazy money to the green agenda, to the infrastructure agenda, to create the SDG agendas, the larger SDG agreements that we've reached.
Can I in the Maldives, to build a water breaker, a meter of it costs $4,000. A meter of water breaker in traditional ways of doing it. And this technology is in the 1950s. And every time we want to build another water breaker, we of course do a project and give it to the World Bank. And the World Bank would make sure that this is done in the 1940s and 50s technology. Or rather, they would lend it when it is done in a technology that they've been usually lending to. And they would ask to do a design. And this design, again, would be done by someone who's been picked by the bank. And they would have assessing and monitoring mechanisms on if the design is fine. And then they would ask for a tender, and we would tender it, and then it would be taken by someone else and build. My point here is the bank must understand that there is new technology to do exactly the same thing. There is a lot of smart methods of doing things. Growing a mangrove is as efficient and effective as building a water breaker. And I was told by a very young physicist the other day that you can actually produce another wave from shore and neutralize the coming wave. Mm-hmm. And therefore have this damn thing done without anything. But at the same time, you could also apparently use this gadget to power the village. So there's a whole lot of new science, smart ideas available, and cheaper, and far, far more cheaper. I think the finance is not coming to these new ideas, to these new methods. That's what I would like to call the new pathway. That's the leapfrogging. That's where I would really like to call leapfrogging this carbon and coming out exactly with the same outcomes, economic outcomes, but through these different methods. So I would like to compile a body of new knowledge that is already here. It's all over the place. And it's already working. But we are not installing these new plants and methods simply because there is a guy in somewhere, in some bank, who haven't got a clue on what we are talking about. And this person, the banker, is very familiar with concrete and steel. And therefore, every solution, apparently, every workable solution is concrete and steel. So your question was, how can we release this money from the banks? Yes, ignorance, and not understanding it, and not believing this. So we must then therefore promote this new technology. And again, I would argue that this new technology would give you a far better return than going to obsolete technology.
Dr. Saran, haven't you mentioned earlier about people keeping tech for themselves. What are you suggesting, that people do open sourcing on clean tech? Are there people who aren't doing that, who could be sharing big tech companies? What did you mean by that?
So, I think this is the third element. So the first is politics, second is finance, and the third is technology. And I think our treatment of intellectual property and our treatment of technology still is framed around the first and second industrial revolutions, not the third and fourth. So we still have patents and rights and the ability to extract value from technology, which was based on practice and which has provenance from the previous century. The challenge is this, and let me try and add to what the president said. This is the challenge. One of the biggest hurdles to ramping up, say, energy systems in countries like India is not just that the bankers and the insurance funds and the pension funds think India is still mystical and unresolvable, but also that the technology hurdle is now a new element. Technology changes every few years. And the banks are worried that are we making a risky investment? So for example, President mentioned that in the last solar bid, we have achieved parity to an imported coal power plant in India. All the investments that would have been made at the previous tariff rates 4 or 5 years ago are now obsolete. So there is a technology risk. And I don't think we have yet reached a solution to pricing technology. Do we back-end the intellectual property? Do we price it alongside the loan tenure? Do we do a complete revamp through a global R&D fund where we give a one-off lump sum to the inventor and then we make it a global public good? We buy it off the person and then we make it available to everyone to deploy. I don't think we've had solutions here because even the big companies, and they are normally the fossil fuel companies who own green technologies. That is another interesting paradigm. It is the big companies who have made money off the old economy who own the new technologies. So in a sense, the commercial viability of these new technologies is still dependent on the fossil fuel economy. They will decide at what price point they will seed it. They will decide at what time it will become deployed widely, because they also have to protect their old business interests. So I think the technology puzzle is a big hurdle. And again, I believe that governments in developed countries have not done their job, and they have actually bowed and they have surrendered to the big companies, and they have not enforced what I would call the stick policy. You have carrots and sticks where you give incentives, but you also have a command and control economy where, for example, come up with certain norms and certain rules that force mass deployment of some critical technologies. And again, I think this is the case where you have allowed rampant exploitation of poor countries for economic gains for a global public good.
Should we open it up to questions from you guys? Maybe if you have a question, you could introduce yourself briefly as well. Anyone have a question?
I always have questions. This is so fascinating, and I'm sorry that I came late. In the U.S., there's a group of companies that are rethinking their focus or their model by ESG, correct? And my question to you is, you've been talking about government investment, but if the Bank of America, for example, takes those criteria seriously, they're actually going to be looking for green investment because in part, their young employees want them to. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious what the role, one, do you see sort of individual companies making a huge difference, individual big private entities making a difference? And two, do you see the next generation of managers, our 30-somethings, actually caring about these issues slightly more in a way that might shift the kind of paradigm you're talking about in terms of who's investing in old technology? So
the answer is, for me, greed is an intergenerational trait. Young bankers, old bankers, they still work on the principle of greed. And I don't see any fundamental shift in investment decisions based on age. I don't see a causal relationship between age and how you invest. I think profits and returns still seem to be the determinant in the banking, in the investment sector and in the banking system post the crisis. I think capital adequacy has become this new throttle which prevents you from deploying capital liberally. On your point of Bank of America, good question. I think Bank of America will have some leeway. If it decides to go green, it doesn't have too much leeway because it still comes under the larger rubric of the banking norms determined through the Basel process, and they will still have sectoral caps. So it's only so much money that they can deploy to a certain sector, and they can't do more than that. So yes, within the sector, they will have some leeway of enforcing carbon compliance, but it's not too much, and it's certainly not adequate for the kind of transformation. Let me go back to my first point. In the next 7 years, India is going to build 175 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity, something Germany took 200 years to do with all fuels. Germany with all fuels is going to be at that mark. India is going to do it in 7 years. The kind of money India needs requires a huge revamp of how we rethink global finance. And we are not asking for aid. Aid cannot do this. I made that first point. The world has made us an offer, which is that we will not help you. And we have accepted that offer in Paris. We have said that this is what we will do. If you can ensure flows of finance and technology, we can do more and we can do better. But we have taken that base offer, which says we are on our own in creating a new model that no one else has adopted before. So global finance requires huge revamp. If we require to scale up to our ambitions, I think the Paris Agreement still falls short of what we need to do. It's a good start, it's a good beginning, but I think we have to be far more ambitious. So for example, in the Paris Agreement, India has made a commitment of this amount of renewable energy in 2030. Our national action plan is 2022. So we are not necessarily going to be waiting for the Paris Agreement tenure to end to achieve our goals. Hopefully we'll be able to do more. But that doing more is going to be predicated by being able to galvanize global capital, by being able to ensure that technology for good is available to all. And I think some of these key questions need to be answered in the next 3 years when the Paris Agreement kicks in 2020.
I think Bank of America and most of these banks and everyone else would get their act together once this becomes an election issue. So my work is on trying to see how we can make climate change an election issue. My view is that once we transform this to be an economic issue, then it's easy to lodge these ideas in political manifestos. While it remains an ethical issue or a human rights issue, it's not so easy to have them in your political manifestos. Just imagine if the next US election is based on this new manifesto. How much of debate that would make it possible, the dialogue that would make it possible. So I would like to work hard on trying to see if we can lodge these ideas. Now, let's say the British Labour Party would like to win the next election, and the Democratic Party in the US would like to win the next election, the Congress Party would like to win the next election, and my party would like to win the next election as well. So how do we win elections? We win elections by promising things to the people, by saying we will create full employment, by saying I'll build you a sewerage system, I'll build you an embankment, a road, I'll build you a school, I'll do this and that. So if we can base these pledges on the new manifesto, on the climate change manifesto, then banks start to understand this. Banks would lend not because their workers are young, but because of profit motive. Now, it's greed in some language, but it's greed in some language, and in English it's greed, and more polishedly it's called the profit motive and the market mechanism. So banks would start lending when the profit motive kicks in and the market mechanism tells it to lend. So I think you can do this once it becomes an election issue.
Question there from the lady.
Sharon Burke with New America, and a former U.S. government official. So I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of my country in any case, but certainly not now. But Mr. President, first I just wanted to thank you for your continued global leadership on these issues, and especially your constructive, optimistic vision, which is, I think, amazing for me that you continue to hold it and to lead the way forward from your current perch. So thank you very much for that. Making it an election issue, I'm feeling encouraged, and I'm trying to hold in optimism what you're saying, but it was an election issue in the United States, and not in a very good way.
It was a moral argument.
Excuse me?
It was a moral argument, an ethical argument in the
Right.
election.
Sounding a great deal like Dr. Saran. He
Yeah,
sounds like
so-
a Trumpista, as a
so
matter of fact.
what-
You
what
sound
I would
very
like to-
much like a Trump promoter in a lot of your comments about the moral imperialism of America. So, but I think that the problem is with the politics in the United States that climate change for some time has been playing a destructive element. And our question is how to depoliticize and how to get it back to what you were saying also, that it's an economic issue and it's an infrastructure and an investment issue, and how to make it something that benefits the American public. I'm not sure how we chart the way back to that, and I'm not sure if we can because of the amount of money and other interests that are invested in the current dialogue. But I hope you're right, that it can be a constructive election issue. I'm not so sure. Just one other comment, Dr. Saran, is that I was not involved as a government official in the negotiations, so I can't comment on the conduct of our team. But I would say, as an inside-outside observer myself, that I think it was the leadership of the government of India and the collaboration and the dialogue between our countries, our governments, that helped transform the agreement and helped transform that negotiation. So I think I saw that as a very constructive partnership, and it's alarming to hear you describe it in such destructive terms, because I think it was that joint leadership that your Prime Minister deserves a great deal of credit for, that helped deliver results in that case. So hopefully that's the spirit we'll go forward in.
What did I say that gives you the impression that I have not actually complimented the
passion.
leadership and the passion
No, the
of,
passion you
of,
said it
of, of Mr. Modi, of Mr. Obama, of Mr. Holland? That was my opening proposition, that despite being given an offer that was subpar, India has accepted the deal because it sees in this deal reality, that energy leapfrogging is real. It is perhaps the only way forward. And irrespective of the world, what the world may or may not do, India has decided for itself that this is its path forward. But that does not mean that I have to support and condone American hypocrisy. And it's not about Trump. The deal was struck when Obama was in office. So I have said nothing that supports Trump, and I have said nothing that condones my Prime Minister's actions. I have said India has moved from being the global trade union leader, the Mr. No, to a Mr. Yes. And that is commendable. And it is doing so of its own steam. So my position on this debate is quite clear. Energy leapfrogging, yes. Carbon imperialism, yes. They both can coexist. That's all I'm saying.
Can I butt in here?
Yeah.
And then I'll offer you one last comment on the United States.
What I mean by making it an election issue is Keynesian economics or monetary economics. Now, we fight elections sometimes based on interest rates, other times based on stimulus packages. Now, these are economic ideas. So can you shift this conversation to be an economic conversation?
Correct.
So climate change is not the election issue.
Employment is.
Employment is.
And can you show?
Sewage systems are. So what I'm suggesting is that there must be a new received, the received economic wisdom is obsolete. And so it is time that we come up with a new economics.
I think, and before we come up with new economics, Mr. President, we need to come up with a new vocabulary. We speak a language that is only understood in this room.
Exactly.
Now, I can tell you there exist sufficient case studies that will demonstrate the employment potential of the renewable sector of green energy is more than the coal sector. But yet, the Democrats fought the election on the basis of saving the planet. The man on the street does not understand. Now, please start speaking a language that some of us can understand. And don't blame Trump for it. You lost the elections.
I would dispute that and say that is not how the Democratic Party in the United States ran, but that is how they were characterized by their opposition. So,
and you had the media as well.
Yeah. Just one last thing about the United States. I think where you were going with that, Mr. President, I completely agree with, and I think you can't underestimate how dangerous this moment is in the United States and how destructive this president could be, especially to this agenda. However, at the state level and at the subnational level and in Bank of America and other quarters in the United States, I think we'll continue to see progress. And the question is, and also, just certain economic forces, we're going to continue to see natural gas driving out coal no matter what. So in the United States. So I think you'll continue to see progress, but it's difficult to underestimate how dangerous the moment is, and particularly on this set of issues in the United States. And so we all, we can all love to hate the United States, but now we're going to find out what it looks like when it is actually a pernicious and destructive element. So,
another question from someone?
Dr. Saran, I was David Allen from the Agilara Trust in Australia. We do a whole bunch of granting and investing to promote or arrest climate change. I was first to applaud your speech about how the white male investors are stupid and racist. I think there's a lot of truth in that. But let me just add a little bit of maybe self-reflection as an investor looking across the world as to where do we put our money and what technologies and what projects to invest in. India looks like a hard place to put your money with the capital controls and the ownership rules. So, yeah, I can't defend the system, but I think there's a little bit you can do to help yourself.
No, and I'll struggle to defend India on that. I think we have to do a lot more. And the next 2 years of my research life are being spent exactly on this. How do we allow three kinds of investors to feel more comfortable with India? Our domestic investors, because we are not even seeing enough domestic investors put the money. So what do we need to change in our own laws and in our own regulations to unlock the potential of our own markets? We need to create more financial market depth within the country, and we have done very badly there, poorly there. Second, how do we bring you guys into the country feeling safe of that your money is not going to be captured and you're going to be allowed to take it back, and your returns are and we need to give you that comfort. Again, I think it's both a fact, because our policies need to be tweaked, and it's also communication. The way we speak to you also needs to change. I think we need to be, we can't believe that we are doing you a favor by allowing you to invest in India. It has to be the other way around. So I think that the tone of our relationship needs to change. And finally, how do we convince these big funds and big government sovereign funds all over the world to shed the credit rating business and join in the climate campaign and in the effort to create more green infrastructure and we will do it. I don't think the challenge is India here. I think we are halfway through that process. We have literally doubled our solar capacity in 1 year last year. I think we are on the road, and I see India being able to find its own answers. I am more worried about South Asia generally, and I am more worried about countries in Africa, because eventually our investments will crowd theirs out, and that is my worry. And we need more money. We need more money in the global system. Otherwise, we will capture the next flows, like China captured the past 20 years of financial flows. We are probably going to capture the next 10 to 15 years of financial flows. So how do we create more money in the market, so as to speak, for some of these countries? But I take your point. I can't defend some of our policies that have prevented investments. But I think we are improving. I think there is a realization that this can't go on.
Did you have a question?
Two comments. Megan Falone from Barefoot College. The first one is, I think it's important to call out and to recognize that the government of India has not only taken the direction that it's taken within India, it is actually investing through us as an organization, a social enterprise, in renewable energy development, technology transfer, and vocational skill building through technology in the renewable energy sector in now 26 countries around the world in the developing global south. And I think that is not an accident. I think that is very much a conscious decision on the part of the government of India to walk the walk and talk the talk. I'd like to come back and make a comment, Mr. President, about what you said about the financial things. So we're social entrepreneurs in this room, and we know that people's behavior generally only shifts when you look at both rewarding good behavior and, of course, clearly delineating the downsides of bad behavior. And I think we are not talking about the cost in the right way. What is being left by the wayside by not leapfrogging in this area is massive. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with access, and it has to do with the cost of health, lost economic development, and lost participation from 40% of the world's population. And this quantification of data, for me, is now essential, because that is the play. You know, the GDP is the business case for energy access in renewables and in decentralized communities, rural communities, in ways that are low cost and highly efficient and leverage economic output.
question, anyone? I've got a question. China, what can be learnt from China's often talked about now as the world's green leader. How true is that, if at all?
You know, my view has always been you cannot you cannot address climate change or any world problem unless you have transparency, unless you have human rights, unless you have democracy, unless you have pluralistic society. So I mean, yes, China seems to be doing a lot of things, and apparently it's getting very rich, and apparently it's very good, but I fail to see that. India would do it. And of course India is going to take time doing it because they're going to have more conversation in it. And when they finally starts doing it, and I think they'll be doing the right thing. I mean, okay, China, suddenly the Chinese premier tomorrow decides that he's going to ban everything.
And they turned on their heel.
Yeah, and
because
then,
they weren't a democracy.
And I don't necessarily think that these are effective policies and options. You can suddenly change, but these sudden changes and jolts don't necessarily give you a sustainable development path. China has historically done this many, many times. It's gone into many directions. And I'm not confident that it would remain in that direction. I would again argue, for instance, in South Asia, an India first foreign policy. It's not because it's a favor to India, but it's because we want Indian Ocean stability. So is China going to be the leader? Is China going to save the world? Is China going to do? I don't think so.
I think this is also something what my colleague from the New America pointed out, that it is actually, this is the Trump effect. If China is going to be the defender of climate, and if China is going to be the last man standing in terms of the global projects, then it says something about the domestic politics of some of our countries around the world. And I think that's one the conversation that needs to be had, that where are we as people if the ethical, moral and global leadership is going to be devolving down to Beijing. I think we need to ask ourselves that. But let me use his term. Let's make the economic argument. I think that China has understood the economic play. China is making a big push for the economic gains that will come from the green endeavors. So I have no doubt that they see this as a huge growth potential. They have reduced the prices of renewable energy projects. They have created smart building initiatives. They have created new technologies that can make efficient utilization and consumption of urban lighting and urban heating, etc. And they are players in the market. So as a green capitalist economy, China is doing certainly very well. It is sometimes outpacing many of their cousins in Europe and America, and they now have the financial muscle, and they have their own World Bank to fund development pathways where the Chinese technologies and Chinese solutions can then be exported to the world. So to that extent that they are doing well in the green market business, really they are doing well, but going green is more than just stopping carbon. It's also about allowing people choice and agency. Like Megan mentioned here, it's also about
I'm sorry, without governance, they're doing the wrong projects at the wrong place, at the wrong price, to the wrong people. For instance, if you take a Chinese aid to the Maldives, they're excellent at building bridges to nowhere. We can't get that bridge from India. We can't, because they'll ask us 10,000 questions. and we would have to go through it every day, and it's just finally would become a nuisance. But that is the nuisance that you have to have sustainable growth. And look at South Asia. Look at all these airports, airstrips, harbors. They've done all sorts of things in many, many places. But I do not know if these are what is required in many, many countries. They're building a bridge in the Maldives for, I think, $300 million. While, that is going to, in my view, consolidate population into two little islands, while we have 2,000 islands. I still would argue that without governance, you will get it wrong. Governments finally do their infrastructure through a tender process, and a transparent tender process. The procurement orders of governments have to be written. And the issue here is I have to write it according to World Bank stencils and the UNDP stencils and other stencils. And these methods are obsolete. So the tender document itself is where you go wrong. Now, you come to the tender document from the legislative agenda. You come to the legislative agenda from your pledges during the elections. You come to your pledges from the manifesto. So again, I think this is fairly simple. Saving the world is, I don't think, a big difficulty. It's just write the proper procurement order. We need a procurement order for Planet B, or to
create a
renovate the planet, to repair the planet. We need a procurement order. So how do you write that procurement order? So the finance of it and the science of it, the economics of it. But what at the end of the day governments need is a procurement order. And how you write that procurement order depends if you would be saving the planet or not.
And in this context, I still believe that amongst the countries who are emerging or developing at this particular time, and some of the developed countries, I think the US-India partnership is seminal. I think if the two of us can continue to do what we did in the last 4 years of the second term of President Obama, which is accelerate our green partnerships, our green energy partnerships, and agree on trilateral cooperation, which means India and America in different geographies, for example, Africa. I think that those kind of relationships will be important. Bringing in India and US to work together in countries in the emerging world would be crucial for seeding both solutions and for a degree of credibility and acceptability from the geographies where we wanting to create change. I think it's an important relationship. Europe, of course, is the third leg of this new triangle, which has to find energy leapfrogging solutions.
Hi, I'm Laurie Gehring. I edit climate change news for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm really interested by this discussion about how the renewables are getting cheap enough that the market should actually solve this problem for us, right? But there seem to be these roadblocks in the way that are political, that are financial, that are just sort of inertia in systems. And I'm curious at what point you see those breaking, or what we can do to make those break faster so that it happens in time to actually deal with this problem at the speed that it needs to be dealt with.
Can I say? Please do the manifesto.
The procurement order.
The procurement order comes from this. So we must make it. Das Kapital was around for a long time. And then Lenin came around and said we could run a country according to this. We have the same knowledge with us, similar knowledge. The science is there, everything is there. Someone needs to come and say, look, we could run a country based on this. So someone needs to do the procurement order of all the government tendering based on this new thinking. So I think that's when we would start seeing financial flows. That's when we would actually start seeing a major impact to saving the planet.
I think I would respond by saying that it's already happened in many parts of the world. And Megan just made, she intervened a while ago, and she will tell you that in many parts of the world, the only idea of energy is solar energy. They have seen nothing before that, and they're unlikely to see any major grid arrive at their village anytime soon. and they will have to rely on renewable for changing their lifeline existences and lifestyle existences eventually. So it's already happened. One. Second, I also think there is a bogus argument being made that markets can do it alone, and that's your point. I think there has to be a regulatory empathy which allows this to be scaled up. The same empathy that we offered to big conglomerates in the past who were exploiting resources under the earth. And I think that empathy is emerging, and I think the Paris Agreement demonstrates through a few initiatives that now there seems to be a new mood to create that favorable regulatory environment. And my last point would be the third point I made this morning, which was we need to get the bankers to sign up to this deal. The bankers have not signed the Paris Agreement, and I still believe that unless we can change the way big funds and big banks and lazy money views the world and prioritizes climate action, we will perhaps achieve what we seek to do today, but it might fall short of what we really need to be doing, which is much more. By saying that I agree to 1.5 degrees temperature rise is by condemning Maldives already. Please understand, when we say 1.5 degrees, I have in an inhuman political way agreed to killing 500 million people. I have signed the death warrant. Please understand what it means. We don't understand this simple fact that every degree rise in temperature kills people. For us, it is acceptable to lose 700 million people because they are largely going to be those who anyways have a life expectancy of less than 45 years, because that's the bottom 20% of the global population has a life expectancy of that level. So it doesn't matter to us because we will find high ground and we will agree to 1.5 to 2.5. We'll play these number games because eventually it just means few people who we don't know, who we can't see on the map, saying goodbye.
No, we need heavy adaptation now. The deed is done. So the Maldives and many low-lying countries must find more innovative adaptation measures. And these adaptation measures also must be new, based on the new technology, and not based on steel and concrete. And again, I would argue that new technology is available.
We've literally got 2 minutes. Or 1 minute. 2 minutes.
At the risk of being presumptuous, to answer the last question on Dr. Kammen's behalf, I think he would have talked about putting a price on carbon. And the article he directed us all to in preparation for this session pointed out that for the first time in the United States, you do have a bipartisan consensus on that, and a Republican group that's put forward a plan for putting a price on carbon. So I think he would have pointed to that were he here. I would also say that the private sector commitment that was made at Paris, it'll be interesting to see where that goes, to put a significant amount of private wealth into energy R&D, and I believe it was called the Breakthrough Coalition. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. I think that was a very hopeful development because it doesn't depend on the action of governments alone. So,
in this last minute we've got, if you had a crystal ball, what's going to happen now? How hot will the earth get? And despite greed, racism, a sort of kind of backing away from global political efforts, is economic pragmatism about clean tech being future? Is that going to save us, whatever President Trump does, and however, even though climate change isn't even mentioned in this country anymore as part of political discourse? President?
Well, my would be yes. My view would be yes, we are going to save the planet. I believe in human ingenuity. And I think all of us might not survive, but we would, even the Maldives would find floating islands or genetically modified coral, or we would probably do all sorts of things and survive. We've been in the middle of the Indian Ocean for the last 20,000 years, and we have a written history that goes back 1,500 years. And I don't want to prepare ourselves to leave. So I would be looking for ways and means to stay. And that would involve new technology. That would involve a lot of new technology. So that would involve the new procurement orders. And so I think, I believe we could write these procurement orders. I've fought against odds many times. I've been tortured twice. I've lost my 20s in prison. And we've been able to come back many times. And again, I'm down and under, and hope to come back. And so I very strongly believe that the planet will survive, and then we will have a better future for the next generation.
So I think we have set up the regulatory architecture, and we have institutional strengths in many big economies today to continue doing what we are doing irrespective of big politics. But if we need to do more, I think political leadership is definitely needed. It's missing today. I think there is a fatigue in those who have traditionally taken responsibility for promoting and protecting global commons and the common spaces. I think that leadership needs to be reinvigorated, else we are going to fall short. Now, I always argue that we have not had our big moment on climate change which can galvanize collective action. I mean, I always argue that if you follow the money, climate is not a big deal. If you follow the money, for me it is. But if you follow where the money is, you will realize that you don't really price carbon as a very serious global issue. And I always give the example of 2009 when at the G20, 20 global leaders met in London a few months before Copenhagen, and committed to, everyone walked to the mic and said, I'm putting $1.5 trillion of fiscal stimulus to save the financial system. I'm putting 2 trillion, I'm putting $500 billion, I'm putting 300 billion. They were all alpha males thumping their chest and spewing out $6 trillion of commitments to save the financial ecosystem and to respond to the financial crisis. 6 months later, 107 global leaders gathered in Copenhagen, and they did not have the courage and the wherewithal to commit $100 billion for the next 11 years. In 2009, they said, climate, what did they tell me? They told me, climate is a $100 billion problem. It is 11 years later. I think it's time to change that discourse. The collective action has to be more urgent, it has to be more ambitious, it has to be larger, and unfortunately, markets will not do that. Maybe President Trump may not either. We need new leadership. Climate demands new leadership. I think we have some positive individuals around the world, one of them sitting next to me, but we need many more if we need to price this problem right. I think carbon tax or taxing carbon is one solution. I think we should be more ambitious. Let's tax consumption. When you tax carbon, you are socializing the bad. When you tax consumption, you're taxing the rich. So let's tax consumption. Let's be much more ambitious in making sure that we get the priority right.
Thank you both. I found that really fascinating. Thank you.